It's been about 6 years since I started hearing the alarm bells that engineers were ringing about AI and its societal and ethical implications. I don't know how I came to hear about it, but somehow it was in the air, and I heard it, and that's part of what explains how I got into doing what I do now. One of the things that I've witnessed over the years that I've been involved in this sort of space is that different companies, different people, government organizations try to figure out how to get their hands around AI ethics by first appealing to a set of principles, ethical principles. There's lots of these lists. There's literally, I don't know, over 200 of these lists or commitments to different ethical values by different organizations of every shape and size. The lists contain various kinds of values. There's lots of overlap, though. So on almost all of them, you'll see things like fairness or justice, privacy, transparency, respect for autonomy, this sort of thing. The thing is, though, that when philosophers, when ethicists do ethics, if you like, we never, or at least we very rarely say, here's the principle of justice, and therefore here's how we should treat this particular case. It's just not what we do. And interestingly, what I've seen is that a lot of companies and government organizations will come up with their list of principles, justice and fairness and privacy, whatever, and then they have no idea what to do. They just don't know what to do. I've had a number of people reach out to me to say, hey, Reed, we've gotten together in our organization, we've got our list of values, and now we want to implement those values, but we don't know how. They just don't know what to do with these principles or values. Perhaps one explanation for why they don't know what to do, because they're just doing the wrong sort of thing, that this approach, let's call it principalism, just doesn't work as an approach to getting your hands around AI ethics and actually making sure that AI is designed and developed and built and deployed in ways that are on the ethical up and up. That's the contention of Ami, who I'll talk to today. His claim is that principalism doesn't work. He articulates three main reasons why it doesn't work, and he really thinks that in order to do ethics well, we've got to do it, if you like, on the ground. We have to do it with the people who will be impacted by the systems, by the AI that we design. There's a lot more detail, of course, and I'll allow him to go into all of that. One thing that I wanted to highlight that is just interesting because I'd never really thought about it before is about the function that ethicists are meant to play in this new world of AI ethics. I think there's a lot of things that they can do, but one thing that he pointed out that I had never heard of was ethicists, when I say ethicists, people with PhDs in philosophy who specialize in ethics, they're particularly good, and because they're trained to understand the value that is underlying the claim that someone has, the ethical claim that they're making. So in this conversation, you'll hear as the sort of backdrop is decisions about whether to deploy robots in healthcare settings. So, for instance, for elderly care. And he said something like, he's heard nurses say, I'm worried I'm not going to get enough face time with my patients, and so I don't want to have these robots. And one of the things that came out of the conversation that he had with nurses and other healthcare practitioners was what they were really saying when they were saying, I'm not going to spend enough face time with my patients, is that's how I instantiate the value of caring for people. That's how I instantiate the value of caring about people. And once you can identify that underlying value, then you can have another kind of conversation, which is something like, maybe we do have these robots, and maybe you do have less face time in some way, but maybe there's some other way of expressing that value of care for your patient. How else might this go? And so being able to abstract from very concrete concerns to value-based concerns allows for a different kind of conversation. That's what Ami claims, and that's what he's practiced. So I thought that was particularly insightful. Okay, there's not much more by way of intro. Don't forget, you can always email me about topics you want me to discuss or people you want me to talk to, issues you want me to address, em@reedblackman.com, as in ethical machines at reedblackman.com. Please review the podcast, 5 stars, share it with your friends, tell everybody about it, and that's all I got. Let's go talk to Ami. So you and Dave, who's not here, wrote this article called More Process, Less Principles, The Ethics of Deploying AI and Robotics in Medicine. So tell me what you mean when you say more process, less principles. And let's put aside the fact that it's grammatically problematic. You don't say fewer principles, which drives me a little bit nuts, but okay, I'll give you that one. Go for it.
Oh, you're going to start with that? Okay, let's,
I mean, come on, less principles, isn't that?
no, because fewer principles would mean that the list contains too many principles and you need to whittle the list down to fewer principles.
Okay.
So what we're saying is less principles, meaning don't use the principlist approach as much.
I see. Okay. Okay. I can accept that, I suppose.
Yeah, you're not the first person to say that.
I'm sure I'm not. You're
It was deliberate.
We're going to be pedantic.
It was deliberate.
Does that make it better or worse, though? I feel like that makes it worse.
Hey.
We made it wrong on purpose. Is that better or worse than it was an accident?
But that's the thing. It's not wrong.
I know it's not wrong. Okay.
That's just the important thing. People actually noticed my article. And how often does that happen? How often does that for philosophers?
You know what? For now on, I'm going to put typos in my articles to get attention and the headlines. Anyway, tell me what the idea is. So first of all, you've already pointed out a problem, right? That there are principles involved. The problem that you've got with AI ethics or ethics in robotics and AI medicine is not the fact that there's a bunch of principles around. I imagine you mean the common ones like fairness and privacy and transparency and explainability and blah, blah, blah. You don't want to whittle them down. People are doing too much with them. So what does it even mean to do that? What does it mean to do too much with principles?
Yeah. So the idea very broadly is, I guess, two. The first is that we don't know a priori beyond very broad ethical themes what specific ethical values and concerns are in play in any specific situation.
What do you mean? Give me an example.
So for example, let's use the example I use in my paper. A facility for like a nursing home is considering having social robots, pursuing social robots. And
so these are like robots that are going to talk to the elderly inmates. Can't be the right word. Residents?
Yeah.
The elderly residents.
Yeah. Yeah. And not just talk to them, but so they do some of the menial tasks, but yeah, they'll also provide them company and do interactive games with them. And so we can imagine somebody who comes to the situation with a principlist point of view. So whatever, at last count, I think there are like 170 different organizations that have put forth lists of principles for AI ethics. Sure. Right. And let's say this is the one true list, right? We got it. We finally did it. We got the one true list of ethical principles that we should use for AI ethics. And so what I'm saying is that you don't know beforehand what the actual ethical issues are going to be.
Sure.
And very broadly, like this would be something about do good, don't cause harm.
Yeah, right.
But you know, these are so abstract that they are not action guiding.
So you've got, okay, should we use robots talking to our elderly patients or residents, provide them comfort, care, etc.? And you could talk about justice and fairness and privacy, but it's not really going to help you solve that problem. Answer or think through moral qualm.
Yeah, if I say to you, no, deploy it in a just way, like, and you're on the board that has to decide whether you're going to deploy this, for example.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, just deploy it in a just way. What does that even mean? So now, actually, we need to back up a second because the scope of our paper is actually narrower. Okay. We are concerned specifically with the ethics of deployment.
Okay.
So what we claim is that in the medical context, so I think only about 4% of all care in the US is delivered by academic medical centers. And what that means is that most medical facilities, when they are introduced to some AI technology and the AI salesman comes up knocking, right? They're not designing the technology themselves.
Sure.
Ready-made, right? And so most of these principles, right, whatever we think of them, are for the development of AI. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't match the situation that most medical institutions are facing, which is they have a ready-made product and they have to decide whether they're going to purchase it. And if they do purchase it, how they are going to deploy it. And so we say like this, these sets of principles, A, they're not designed for this task. B, they inherit all these other problems that come with any principalist approach, regardless of whether it's deployment or development or design. And I can get more into the specifics of the problem
Yeah.
of principalism.
Well, look, I'm not convinced yet that we need separate. Let's suppose that we need principles. I'm not convinced that we need separate principles for design and development versus deployment. It might just be the case that there's different things you got to look out for. There's different ways of being, say, unjust or disrespectful that you might consider during the design process. And you might consider other ways of being, say, disrespectful or unjust when deploying or when using. It's not obvious to me that this tells against a so-called principalist approach, whatever that amounts to. So that's one way I want to push back. Yeah, so I don't know, why don't we just start there?
Okay. I don't know. I can accept that. I don't, maybe it's possible. I don't know. I guess I want to focus on the criticism or the weaknesses of principalism itself, whether we use it for design, whether we use it for development, or whether we use it for deployment. I think principalism itself is incomplete. I won't say we need to throw it away. I'll say it's incomplete without process attached to it.
Okay, interesting. It's incomplete without a process. So give me an example where we've got some case where we might deploy, we've got principles, but somehow there's something missing without the appropriate procedures. So where do procedures come in?
Yeah, we can go back to our toy case here. Actually, it's a real case. They're doing it in Minnesota right now, and also in some of the Nordic countries, Finland and Holland.
This is like an editorial.
Yeah.
Start like you haven't talked about that case before.
Okay, so let's consider the case of deploying social robots, intelligent social robots in a care home. So, first of all, the principalist approach doesn't tell us anything about who is going to apply the principles. Okay. And this matters because if I say, make sure you deploy it in a just way, even among philosophers, there's no agreement over what justice means, going back all the way back to Socrates,
Sure.
right? And even if you're an egalitarian about justice, even egalitarians don't agree about in what respects things should be equal. And so telling principle that says that deployment should be just doesn't tell us what interpretation of justice we should use, and it doesn't tell us whose interpretation of justice we should use. And that's what we set out to address.
But how's process going to fix any of this? Okay, the complaint is a common one. The principles are too high level, too abstract, too generic to be directly applicable to any particular use case. Because we've got to think about what constitutes just in this particular use case, and that's going to vary by a number of things. One, about the actual facts on the ground, so to speak, but also about what kinds of outcomes we find or we judge to be just, fair, equitable, whatever you want. But I throw some procedures in there. Are the procedures just about, okay, let's deliberatively, collectively figure out what we think would constitute a just outcome in this particular use case, or what would constitute a just process? Is that what the processes are meant to do?
So that's a great question. So the processes are meant to, what's the word? Cover up or, compensate for the weaknesses of principalism itself. So I think it'll be important to just quickly go over the three that we identify in the paper. And these are not these are not anything that we're the first ones to say. These are just either in the air. So one is, I've already alluded to, what we call the ambiguity challenge. So we talk about justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, privacy. These are all very broad and abstract terms. And what justice means to somebody in northern Thailand and what justice means to someone in Manhattan is not the same thing, right? So we want to make sure that the interpretation of justice is context sensitive, that the people who are subject to the policy decisions, that their interpretation, that their understanding of justice is the one that's in play, not the one that was developed by a bunch of academics that were, hired by the UN or by the EU or some other body. Regardless of whether you think justice or regardless of what you think should be on the list, there's still this problem of what is the correct understanding of this principle, right?
Sure.
And ideally, we want it to be sensitive to the stakeholders involved in that decision, right? So that's number one. The second one is what we call the ranking challenge, right? And so any ethical system with more than one value will inevitably have situations where the values can.
Sure.
And so you need some hopefully non ad hoc way of figuring out what do we do when these two values conflict. So you
Sure.
rarely
So
get a free lunch.
benevolence. You have like benevolence and respect for people's autonomy.
Sure.
Benevolence
Yeah.
encourages you
All day
to
long.
move to help. Right. Respect for autonomy says keep your hands off. These things come into conflict sometimes. So how do you balance these things appropriately?
Yeah. So here's the thing, like situation A, we gave more weight to autonomy. In situation B, we gave more weight to beneficence. Why? Right.
Sure.
So you need some sort of justification for why you are weighing one value more in one situation and less in another. So you need to
Yeah.
justify the order in which you rank the values that are in play.
Sure. Incidentally, an ethical wonky, like a policy wonk, an ethics wonk point. But you could have the same complaint even if you got one principle. If your principle, this is a point made by the philosopher W.D. Ross. The
Uh-huh.
utilitarians say they want to maximize the good, but there's lots of different kinds of good things, and sometimes those good things can come into conflict. We value, I don't know, knowledge. We also value aesthetic beauty. Suppose we have a course of action where we have to choose between maximizing knowledge or beauty. It's not that knowledge is always better than beauty and beauty is always better than knowledge. You got to balance them. So even though you've got the one principle, bring about the most amount of good, you're still going to have to engage in this kind of balancing act between the kinds of goods that you're going to maximize because there's not a clear ranking among the kinds of goods in the world. You had said, if you got anything more than one principle, according to Ross, and it sounds like a pretty good argument, even if you got one principle, you're still going to have to engage in this balancing act.
Yeah, I think like the hardcore utilitarians are going to say, no, you can reduce everything to pleasure or whatever it is.
Yeah, if you're
Satisfaction.
like that.
Yeah.
Sure. But then you
So
better not have higher and lower pleasures or you're in trouble. 'Cause
exactly.
then, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But anyway, the thing is, these lists by definition have more than one value,
Sure.
right? And so they are all susceptible to this problem. And then
Yeah.
the third problem is what we call the tacit exclusion problem. Like I said, when you walk into an ethical situation, it's especially in medicine, it's unlikely that a priori you can come into that situation knowing what values are in play and that every single value that's in play is contained on your list.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this right. So we've got a general approach in the AI ethics world where we say, hey, here are the values that we develop, design, deploy AI with. And while the lists vary across the 150, 200 plus organizations, there's a Venn diagram with lots of overlap around things like justice or fairness, privacy, human in the loop, which is a weird thing to value. Anyway, I'll put that
Mhm.
to the side. Respect for persons, respect for autonomy, blah, blah, blah. So you get this list. There's three main problems that you articulated. One is something like uh, the, the value specified at that abstracted level underdetermines what actually ought to be done in a given situation, even when you know the value applies.
Not
We know
only
that,
that, but different people are going to interpret the values differently.
sure, different people will apply it differently. So then there's an open question about what constitutes the best or at least the appropriate or at least the not inappropriate application of that generic value to the case at hand. So that's
That's
something
right.
like an undetermination problem. Second problem is something like what do you do when those values conflict? The principles themselves don't tell you what to do when those values conflict, or the values
That's
themselves
right.
don't tell you.
Exactly.
And there's this open question about how do we appropriately balance or not inappropriately balance these things in different kinds of contexts. And the third one is something like, I heard you say two things. One is that there's a kind of ignorance that we have to grapple with when you come to a case. The case is complex, like social robots in elderly healthcare, and you're like, wait, is justice an issue here? So there's a question as to what values are at play. But then there's a second related one I thought I heard you say, which was something like, we might not know whether our list of values is exhaustive in articulating the entire space of ethical possibility or something along those lines.
That's yeah.
It's not an exhaustive list of the ethical world.
Yeah, here's the thing. Yeah. Is you can't have an exhaustive list, right? Because an exhaust, maybe you could. So I went with one of my classes. I had this. Let's list all the values that we can think of,
Yeah.
and we came up with things like 36. So you can imagine, like the organization says, no, we're going to include all the values on the list. That was completely impractical, right? So
Oh
yes,
yeah,
you
it's
could
like those.
list them.
It's like those idiotic lists where people are like, "Oh, we've discovered 137 human biases." It's like, what the hell are you going to do with this giant pie chart of 137 human biases? Now you're going to go through and procedurally go 1 through 137. Did we
Yeah.
manifest this bias? Did we manifest that bias? Then you have to check to see if, in applying any of those biases and checking to see whether you were subject to any of those biases, you were biased in that judgment by 137, and then so on ad infinitum. So there's like this ridiculous cottage industry of listing all the biases in a way that's completely impossible to operationalize, completely impossible to layer into procedure.
Yeah. And this is exactly the point, is that the people who are the decision makers need it, like practical processes and a practical list. Like they have to make the problem practical,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And a list of 37 values, like
Yes,
how's it
yeah.
going to help you?
Yeah.
It's going to make it
Yeah.
worse. And but the problem also runs the other way, which is, okay, you can't have too many values. Let's constrain to the most important values, like that, where the Venn diagrams agree. So let's have 4 principles. So let's have 5 principles,
Sure,
right? You
sure.
can manage that. The problem is, you go into the situation with the list, you're tacitly excluding, you're assuming that everything, all the ethical issues are going to
It's got to
be
fall in that
covered by
bucket.
that list.
Yeah.
Of course, you can say, no, this list is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Of course, there are other values. But the thing is, by walking in there with the list, you're going to be attending to certain values much more than other values. So the example I always use is the value of caring, right?
Mm.
So on none of those lists does the value of caring come up. But certainly in medicine, we think that caring is important.
Yeah.
So people are deciding, should we have these social robots in elderly care homes? For me, like the most important question is not like autonomy. It's,
Mm.
does this create an environment of caring, or does it detract from an environment of caring? Because
Oh, that's
ultimately
interesting.
that's what we want.
Yeah.
But if it's not on the list, it's very easy to miss.
Yeah.
Related to this problem is, who is deciding which list to use, right?
Yeah.
And it's probably going to be hospital administrators and maybe some doctors.
Yeah.
And so we're constraining the scope of values that we're considering in the decision.
So yeah. Okay. Wait. There's a bunch of things going on that I think are super interesting. One is that I think some of this has to be exactly right, and I've seen large companies come up with these lists where. So one company I have in particular, very multi-billion-dollar company in countless countries. They've got their framework for AI ethics, and they have the usual suspects like privacy and transparency and explainability, fairness, justice, and then they have this sort of safety as one of the values.
Yeah.
And I said something like, "Hey, where do you put something like potentially undermines democratic institutions? Where would you put that?" And they were like, "Safety? Where would you put causes anxiety? That'd go under safety too." So safety just became this massive grab bag of all the things that can go ethically wrong that are not in the other categories. So
Yeah.
which renders it completely useless. The other thing, and I wonder if this is the direction in which you're going, you could come up with a list, and I've done this before, categories that are meant to exhaust the ethical space that there is, the logical space of ethical rights and wrongs. And I've done this in conjunction with other philosophers, and we've come up with a list. And I put it into 6 or 7 categories, something like that. But one thing that I realized is that when we hear things like mental or psychological harm, trained philosophers, trained ethicists, there's lots of stuff that they're thinking about. So if you ask a philosopher to think about the ways in which people can become emotionally harmed in this context, we'll think of 1,000,000,001. But the non-ethicists, the people who haven't trained for this kind of thing in decades, they might think of 1 or 2 things. And a list to a philosopher might be one list in the hands of say, a trained ethicist is going to be different than that list in the hands of a nurse or a doctor. And
Yeah.
then I start thinking, maybe it's not the list, it's the people wielding the lists, and we need ethicists involved somehow. Is that the
Great.
direction
So
that you're going in?
yeah. So the framework that we offer that kind of addresses these shortcomings for principalism is what we call participatory deliberative conservatism. I have to say that 5 times fast.
Catchy. Yeah, it's very catchy.
Yeah, I know. So here's the thing, right? So It's participatory in the sense that the decision makers are drawn from a broad group of stakeholders. Okay. It's not just a group of doctors and physicians that have to satisfy a safety commission, data privacy commission. It includes patients, it includes nurses, it includes possibly caretakers, anybody who is going to be causally affected in some kind of significant way by this technology. Okay. So that's the first step. It's participatory.
Sure.
The second part of it
And sorry,
is
quick
that it's
question.
yeah.
This framework that you're articulating, this sort of criteria by which you come to this is about whether it's ethical to deploy or whether and
Yes.
how to deploy a particular AI or robotic solution in a particular use case. So
Yeah.
it's highly contextualized. Okay. So
Yes.
step
It's
one,
that's
get a bunch of people involved, bring together relevant stakeholders.
yeah. So we call this the pilot committee. So you have a pilot committee. It's
Yep.
made up of elements of these diverse groups. Okay. But it's not going to be, the pilot committee can't be so large that it's unwieldy. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Some people say, oh, we need data science teams that are representative of the diversity of humanity. And I think, are you going to get 175 data scientists? You're going to
Yeah.
get a white dude, a black man, a black woman, a Vietnamese woman, a Vietnamese man, a Cambodian man. There's too much diversity. You can't have it all. Yeah, it's going to have to be
Yes.
constrained.
Yeah. Suitably constrained. Right. And then, so that in the first stage, this is the thing. They just articulate. So first, there are two decisions that have to be made. The first is whether to adopt the technology at all. And then once they decided to adopt the technology, they have to decide how they're going to adopt the technology.
Hmm.
In the first stage, they just articulate their concerns and their values in a specific way. Not, oh, I am worried about beneficence. No, like in very, like the way normal people talk, right? A nurse might say, in this case of social robots, I'm worried that I won't get enough face-to-face time with patients if we have a
Mm.
robot in there with them. So we're going to do this in a way that normal human beings talk about value, not the way philosophers talk about value.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's the first step. And then we're going to use like a variety of social science techniques that are appropriate to that context to broaden our sample. So now we're going to go to the rest of the nurses in the institution, and we're going to have survey techniques or structured interviews or whatever's appropriate to the situation, right? And also caretakers or patient populations. Get some feedback. This is what we're thinking about doing. What are your thoughts? What are your concerns? And then we enter the deliberative component, because it's not enough for people to say, I want,
Hmm.
right? This is one thing. So as we haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm a clinical ethicist, right? So I work face to face with patients, and patients ask for all manner of things that are not medically appropriate. And they are certainly not sensitive to cost when it's a third party payer. Okay. And so we need a deliberative element where we take these hyper specific concerns that are articulated in a colloquial way, right? And we identify, okay, what is the value underlying that? What value is this an instantiation of, right? So the
Okay.
nurse that says, I'm worried I'm not going to get enough face to face time with my patient, they are articulating a concern for the value of caring. Okay. So one of the techniques that we learn in biomedical mediation is people will articulate their complaints, and what they're really doing is articulating values, but in a highly specific way. But what you want to do is identify like the mid-level value. So not like beneficence or respect for autonomy, but what's the mid-level value? And here's the cool thing. When you identify the mid-level value that they're actually concerned about, there are many ways to instantiate that value. And the mistake people make is they get fixated, right? I need face-to-face time with my patient. But what they really are worried about is that we're detracting from a caring environment, right? But
Hmm.
there's more than one way to do that. And so once we identify the underlying value, we can find different ways to achieve that different end.
Okay, so that's interesting. So is that a place where you think something like ethicists makes
Yes.
sense?
This is because this is what we're trained to do.
So that's interesting. It's interesting because when I think about ethicists helping to engage in deliberation, I think about professors in the classroom. And I think I've taught medical ethics dozens of times, and we talked about abortion and euthanasia. And I take it that part of my job was to facilitate that conversation, point out that this person raised a certain kind of objection to a premise that the other person articulated. And it's abstract philosophical reasoning about arguments. But what's interesting is that what you're pointing out is that ethicists are particularly good at ferreting out the underlying values behind the kind of very concrete complaints that people make. That there's a way in which they could abstract from the particulars that
Mm.
the person. So I won't be able to care for my patient. I won't be able to see my patient one on one. And the philosopher's going to start asking things like, what makes it important for you to see your patient one on one? Because that's how I care for them. That's how I make sure that they're okay. Okay, so what you really are concerned about is making sure that they're cared for, that you're caring for them in the right way. Yes. Okay. Are there ways you can do that while still having decreased time? I don't see how. And then, but if they say, I don't see how, that already means I take it. If you could show them how, they might be open to that alternate course of action because it's still a way of making sure that their value of caring for that person is realized.
Exactly right. And so this is because what we have is we have diverse stakeholders with different values and different concerns. And so what we need to do is find a way to reconcile them.
Yeah.
And the only way we're going to reconcile them is if we do this work of identifying the underlying value. Right. And because that gives us ways of compromising or achieving that same value in different ways. And so that's the deliberative component.
And can you say something about why you characterize them as mid-level values? What are mid-level values, and what? Maybe if I understood what exactly those are, I'd get a clear picture of what deliberative role they're playing. That the abstract appeals to justice and respect
Yeah.
for autonomy don't do. Yeah, what are these mid-level values?
Yeah. So I take mid-level values to be stuff like privacy, feeling cared for, like all these things. I think you can squish them into beneficence and respect for autonomy. So like privacy, people say, is derived from respect from autonomy,
Yeah,
feeling like a sense of belonging. Maybe like squish that into beneficence, right?
right.
But when we talk about like just beneficence or respect for autonomy, it's too vague and abstract to really give us practical guidance on what to do.
So what if I said something like mid-level values are ways of realizing higher level or higher order values? Ways of respecting people's autonomy include respecting their privacy, I don't know, not overstepping the bounds in terms of what you want versus helping them to understand what they want. So it's ways of realizing those values. That's a
Yes,
mid-level value.
that's right. But
Okay.
they're more tractable and they're more understandable to non-philosophers and just everyday people.
Right. And so what you're really abstracting from are those, I think you're abstracting to those mid-level values from their concrete, I'm not going to see my patient enough.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay, we've got this framework whose name is so well branded I forgot it already. But it's deliberative. No, sorry. What was the first one? It was started with an F.
Participatory,
Yeah,
deliberative conservatism. And we haven't talked about the conservatism
let's get
part
to
yet.
conservatism. Yeah.
Okay, so the conservatism is this. So I think of medical ethics like a constitutional democracy, right? So the people, they can have some say in the laws by which they are governed, but they can't choose any laws. The laws that they choose are constrained by the Constitution. Okay. And the same goes to medical ethics. Patients can ask for any kind of care they want, but we're not obligated to provide care that conflicts with the core medical values.
Okay. Can you give an example of that?
Yes. A patient can't ask for care that will be medically futile or that will cause that reasonably foreseeable more harm than benefit to the patient.
Okay.
Okay. They can ask for it. Sure. You can ask,
Sure.
but there's
But
no duty to provide it.
a doctor could justifiably decline that to perform that or to provide that kind of
That's right.
treatment.
The
Yeah.
way I put it is we're not Burger King.
You can't have it your way. That's the joke.
Yeah, that's right. But but there's another important reason for the conservatism, which is that even though patients and their caregivers will be affected by the choices that construct the care environment, it is the hospital administrators and the doctors that bear the moral and legal responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. And so that's what gives administrators and doctors the authority to say no to certain wishes from the patient stakeholder group.
So what is being conserved in the conservatism?
Adherence to the regulatory and established legal norms of the medical profession.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, going back to the constitutional analogy, right? We can change the constitution. It's just hard and it takes a lot of work and it happens slowly over time. So the regulatory framework and the medical ethical norms can change over time. They're not stuck forever.
Okay, big picture, the idea is we've got these high level principles: fairness or justice and privacy and transparency and respect for autonomy, blah, blah, beneficence. And they're useless for the three reasons that were articulated.
Mhm.
They underspecify, they come into conflict, and they don't exhaust all the kinds of ethical issues that you might confront. Those are the three. And then the idea is what we need instead is first, we just need non-philosophers, just the people on the ground, the people involved, doctors, nurses, patients, family of patients, etc. Maybe insurance people are supposed to have a voice. I don't know. Get the relevant stakeholders. They're supposed to participate in a conversation about whether we should adopt this technology, and if we should adopt it, how should we deploy it? Although I imagine there's going to
Mhm.
be some gray area there. We should adopt it on the condition that we deploy it in such and such a
Yeah,
way.
sure.
We shouldn't
Yeah,
adopt it otherwise.
that's right. Yeah.
And that's part one of the process that you want to introduce, bringing these people together. Part two of the process is not just a new process, but a new person, an ethicist. I think this is what you're pointing to. You want an ethicist in the process to help uncover, reveal the underlying values behind the people who are engaged, in some cases anyway, reasonable disagreement about whether to deploy or how to deploy.
Yeah.
And
So with it, yeah.
by ferreting out those underlying values, there can be a sort of negotiation on what can be done, but it's not a compromising values. It's figuring out different ways that people can still realize their values, even if it wasn't in the way that they originally thought that they had to.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful to go back to the three criticisms of the principalist approach that motivate this. So remember, one of the problems with principalism is that it underspecifies the values. We want the interpretation of those values to harmonize with the understanding of those values of the people who are subject to the decisions. It does no good for the people in Omaha, but they have one conception of justice, and then, but applied to their situation is a conception of justice that is completely foreign to them. The people subject to the decisions, it is their understanding of those moral norms that should be used. That's the first thing. So that solves the ambiguity problem, right? So how do we understand justice in this case? We understand it in the way that the people who are subject to this decision understand it. That's how, right? The second problem is the ranking challenge. According to what criteria do we rank these various values that are in play here, right? And it has to be non ad hoc. You can't just, in one situation, rank them one way, in another situation, rank them another way, right? And have no justification for that difference in rankings. What justifies it is the deliberative process by the people who are subject to the decision. Right? They're the ones that ranked it that way. It is justified because they're the ones subject to the effects of that decision. And then,
Okay,
sorry, go ahead.
okay, principles, we need more meat on the bones, and we need to know how to apply the values in cases that conflict. And the deliberative, the communal or participatory deliberative process, and it creates that further specification and creates, ideally anyway, the grounds on which to weigh one value as more important than another in a given case. And presumably you
Yes.
want something like consistency of the application of those values across various use cases. You can use previous use cases to say, we rank them this way in this case, we should do the same thing in this case because it's sufficiently similar to the previous case such that we should come to the same conclusion.
Yes and no. So you could have the same technology deployed in different ways in two different locations. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because the way people in Manhattan will rank those values is going to be different from the way people in Japan rank those values,
Right.
right?
Sure.
But that's what justifies the different rankings, right? It's not ad hoc.
It's not, you didn't flip a coin. It's deployed differently because the people on the ground who will be affected by these things hold different values, different norms. And so
Exactly.
it's shaped by those facts. Yep.
And another kind of piece of the puzzle here is if you've read any literature, especially different medical boards, you always hear the terms patient centered care, shared decision making, right?
Hmm.
And really what we're doing is we're extending those ideas to the care environment itself. Because
Sure.
as AI fundamentally changes the way that we relate to each other, and it's going to change the sorts of choices we have available to us in the medical context. So why wouldn't we apply that same mentality to decisions about the care environment itself? So that's why the participatory element insists on bringing the patient into the deliberative process. And there's another virtue to our approach that I want to highlight, which is its epistemic virtues. So healthcare environments and institutions are extremely complex systems. And we know, let's speak a little wonky here and think about Hayek, right? Hayek's The Information Problem. So his whole point was in complex systems, you can't have only a small cadre of decision makers at the top making decisions about the economy because they don't have access to the information at the ground level for what's
Sure.
going on. And so what does a participatory approach do? It solves the knowledge problems that complex systems have, right? So if you bring in nurses and caregivers and patients, you get the information that only they have that administrators don't have.
So that's part of why you want the participatory. It's not merely for the varying ethical views, but it's for just the on the ground insights that different people have.
Yeah. And as with AI, there are always unintended consequences, right? We
Yeah.
can mitigate some of those if we have more and better information.
Yeah, that's fair. Let me push back on just one thing. So this all seems totally reasonable to me. I'm on board with thinking that just listing a bunch of principles doesn't do much. I'm on board with thinking if you just give a list of principles to some data scientists, for instance, or just a bunch of doctors, a bunch of nurses, they're not really going to know what to do with that thing. In the hands of a philosopher who's been trained ethicist, yeah, it means something to them. But that's because but at that point the list is, it's just like an extra thing that we might use. But we never actually, no ethicist, no self-respecting
Where's my
ethicists.
list? Where's my list? I can't do it without
Exactly.
the list.
Exactly. No one, no decent philosopher has this sort of list. It's ridiculous. And so if we have to dumb it down to a list, then the people who are using that list are not going to be able to use the thing. It's just not going to be plausible that they can use it. So I'm on board with that. And I've written elsewhere things like we need something like something akin to institutional review boards, something like IRBs or something like ethics committees in hospitals in order to, yeah, design and deploy in an ethically safe way. Okay, fine. But one problem you might think is that, and this is especially with the participatory thing, I don't stress the participatory thing because it seems to me to be hard to scale, right? If you're talking about it's a single hospital, they're not dealing with so many crazy ethically complex cases that there's a relevant team that could take care of it. You can get the stakeholders in a room more or less quick enough. But if you're really large, let's say you're an organization that you
Yeah,
own
like a healthcare
hundreds of
system,
hospitals or, yeah,
Kaiser
healthcare system.
Permanente or something.
Exactly. Is this really, is it plausible to scale this approach is the question?
I think there are limits to its scalability because it is by design for local deployment decisions. And, what I would counsel Kaiser Permanente, if they find my paper and say, hey, let's do this,
Yeah.
I would say you might consider doing this approach not for your whole system, but by region, because you'll capture regional values, right? Or if a particular hospital serves a distinct population,
Yeah.
cultural population, then you might want to restrict the deployment decision to that
Yeah.
group.
Yes, I see that as being as a respectable move, but part of me is just thinking about the pace at which AI is getting developed and deployed. That I don't know. I don't know that they have the time. In certain cases, yes, but the time to get it's the participants that are the problem. It's like culling together those participants and getting their insights and their moral views, it takes work. Even if you're doing structured interviews, even if you're doing surveys, just to write the survey and to get it out and to get people to respond and to analyze the survey and then to discuss the findings, this takes a bunch of time. And if you're talking about if a healthcare system is taking on dozens and dozens, if at least just for now, dozens of AI applications a month or a quarter, 100 a year, whatever it is, and I'm not just thinking about today, but I'm thinking about next year and the year after, how can they possibly keep up with that pace? And then that suggests to me, and maybe I'm wrong about this, the participatory stuff is going to have to take a back seat, and we're just going to have some other way of substituting for the actual participants. And then my thought is, and maybe this is, I don't know, too philosopher-centric or something like that, you have ethicists who are good at thinking about the different kinds of stakeholders and how they might get ethically wronged in various ways.
Yeah, once again, we find ourselves in Plato's Republic, where it all started.
I'm not going back into the cave. I'm leaving them in there.
Yeah. I think this is a great criticism. I have not heard this criticism before. I think you're right that as the pace of technological adoption accelerates, it's going to be increasingly difficult to employ this process. So in my view, what that means is we just need to choose carefully about when we deploy. Maybe we can't deploy this process for all decisions, right? Maybe like when we're deploying an AI system for the billing function or something like this, or a physician's note taker or something,
Sure.
we don't need patient input. So I guess what we want to maybe restrict this to is when patient care is going to change significantly, or the kinds of interactions that patients have with staff is going to change significantly. Then this is the place where this process is appropriate. But it doesn't mean that every decision to deploy AI has to run through the process.
Yeah, that sounds right. And I would say something like in high risk cases, maybe you would need something like the participatory part of the framework. Patient care or direct patient care seems to me a subset of those high risk cases. I'm sure there are other kinds of high risk, just automated ways of cataloging and, as it were, submitting the appropriate codes to the insurance companies, on the basis of which people get approved or denied care. Now that's high risk, but it's not doctors and nurses talking to patients or something like that. And then the question, and it's really in some sense an empirical question, what's the quantity of high risk cases that are going to come across, say, a Kaiser Permanente or something along those lines? And is that number low enough such that we can get participants involved in every high risk case? Or is the number just too high that the participatory stuff is just not plausible?
Yeah, I think this is a great line of thought, and maybe something that maybe I'll want to write about. I like this.
Great.
So let me just offer this. This is what MD Anderson does where I work. We have a standing group of volunteers that are former patients or families of former patients, families of current patients. And they're a standing group of volunteers that volunteer for a 2-year period to take surveys and give feedback and just and patient advocates, I should say, and to be the patient voice when we do research on quality improvement type stuff and quality assessment. And so maybe this is like a call to other hospitals to adopt this model, especially public hospitals, is that you need to develop this kind of infrastructure.
Yeah, that'd be reasonable. It might be the case that the framework works really well on a small scale, and there's plenty of opportunities for this kind of framework to do a ton of good. And then there's a separate question about how much can it be scaled, and is there a point at which it breaks?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly legitimate concern.
Yeah. Cool. This is super interesting. I thought this was really interesting. It's really interesting in particular to see the way that you think of the role that ethicists have to play. I don't think it's a way that maybe it was implicit in the way that I've thought about it before, but I think the way that you articulated it is really clear. Anyways, yeah, I thought this was really great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one.
He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.